Is it recording now?
Yeah. Yeah, it's recording. Okay. So I'll read from the George Orwell quote.
Yes.
All right. Um, so the chapter is titled "The City of Bypass Variegated," and the newness of everything, the raw mean look. Do you know the look of these new towns that have suddenly swelled up like balloons in the last few years? Hayes, Slough, Dagenham, and so forth. The kind of
Hussein,
chillness.
Hussein, yeah. Do you want? Can someone put the text on the screen? Do you think that will make it easier?
Yeah, you'll have to make somebody the presenter. Who wants to? Daria, you want to share your screen?
No, actually I can't. I'm traveling actually.
You can't do it. Purva, can you do it?
Yes.
So just share your screen and the
You have
first.
to make your present.
That's page number 49.
Where is Purva in this? Okay, I made you a presenter.
Okay. Yes.
All right.
Okay. Can you see?
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So the George
Purva,
Orwell.
mute yourself, please.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Pura, just scroll up so you can see the George Orwell quote. Yeah. And the newness of everything, the raw mean look. Do you know the look of these new towns that have suddenly swelled up like balloons in the past few years? Hayes, Slough, Dagenham, and so forth. The kind of chillness, the bright red brick everywhere. The temporary looking shop fronts full of cut price chocolates and radio parts. George Orwell coming up for air. Come, friendly bombs, and fall on slow. It isn't fit for humans now. There isn't grass to graze a cow. Swarm over death. Come bombs and blow to smithereens. Those air-conditioned bright canteens. Tin fruit, tin meat, tin milk, tin beans. Tin minds, tin breath. Mess up the mess they call a town. A house for 97 down. And once a week for half a crown for 20 years. John Betchman Slow continued to in 1937.
Okay.
Should I
So,
start reading from the first?
Yeah, I'll just explain what the first excerpt is about. So it talks about how in the 1900s, the last chapter we read was about the horrors of the 19th century slum city and how the reaction to these horrors of the slum city led to various new attempts in town planning. And so the giant city was changing. It explains how the city was changing, partly through the reaction of legislators and local reformers, and also partly through market forces. And what he points out in this first paragraph is that it was never clear what came first, the suburbanizing chicken or the philosophical egg. Like, did suburbanization begin to happen already with market forces? Or was it these ideas and theories that were proposed by these various thinkers or town planners? Was that what led to this kind of urban sprawl that they began to experience? So what he points out is that this chapter 3 actually explains the process of suburbanization and what actually had begun to take place, and takes us through what happened, the changes that were occurring in cities in London and New York. While chapter 4, in fact, talks about the ideas or some of the influences and ideas that led to this kind of imagination about deconcentration and the decentralization of this large urban conurbation or metropolis. So, okay, so I think, Hussein, you can start reading now.
Yeah. Almost precisely in 1900, as a reaction to the horrors of the 19th century slum city, the clock of planning history started ticking. But paradoxically, as it did so, another much older and bigger timepiece started to drown it out. The very problem that the infant planning movement sought to address almost instantly began to change its shape. Much of the philosophical founders of the planning movement continued to be obsessed with the evils of the congested Victorian slum city, which indeed remained real enough, at least down to World War II, even to the 1960s. But all the time, the giant city was changing, partly through the reaction of legislators and local reformers to these evils, partly through market forces. The city dispersed and deconcentrated. New homes, new factories were built at its suburban periphery. New transportation technologies, the electric tram, the electric commuter train, the underground railway, the motor bus, allowed this suburbanization process to take place. New agencies, building societies, public and non-profit housing agencies exploited the opportunities thus offered. Cheap labor and cheap materials reduced the real costs of new housing, especially in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Better, more suitable planning and development regulations curbed the congestion and also some of the tedium of the 19th century cities. The result was an extraordinary and quite sudden improvement in the housing standards of a wide spectrum of the population. But the results were often visually unimpressive and sometimes woeful, not maybe to those immediately affected, but certainly to those who styled themselves expert guardians of the public taste. And all this took place even while the pioneers were writing, campaigning, exerting influence on the body politic. The resulting dilemma is an unresolvable dilemma for the writer and the reader of planning history. It is never clear which came first, the suburbanizing chicken or the philosophical egg. But after all, it does not matter. The story only makes sense if both lines are understood together. So, though it is a logical impossibility, this and the following chapters, above all the next, need to be read simultaneously. The process of suburbanization, especially the market led variety, was far more pervasive and more evident in London and New York than in Paris or Berlin or other European capitals. And in certain key aspects, the role of public transport, the importance of cheap long term mortgages, the relationship between private and large scale public developments, London remained the most interesting, the most vital, the most evidently problematic of all the great cities in these years. So the story had better focus on it. The
Okay.
London County Council.
So,
Okay.
yeah. So I can't see the text. Is it? Can everybody else see it?
Yeah, I can see it. It's there.
Okay. Okay. Fine. All right. So, okay. So the next section, which is the London County Council starts to build, actually talks about how improved means of locomotion was seen as the first step to cure all the housing difficulties of London. Yeah. Continue reading.
Okay. Right at the start of the new century, the British census of 1901 showed just how acute remained London's problems of congestion and overcrowding. Some 45% of families in one inner London borough still lived in one or two rooms, while in a whole ring of neighboring boroughs, the proportion exceeded one third. That year, Charles Booth published yet another paper extolling the virtues of improved means of locomotion as the first step towards the cure of the housing difficulties of London. What was needed, Booth argued, was a large and really complete scheme of railways, underground and overhead, as well as a network of tram lines on the surface, providing adequately for short as well as for long journeys, a system extending well outside the present metropolitan boundaries into the outskirts of London, wherever the population has gone or may go. True, Booth, never a believer in government action save in dire necessity, saw this as a means to free the private builder to provide the cure. But the more collectivist mind of the London County Council's Progressive Party had already moved in the same direction. Though the Royal Commission of 1885 had recommended rehousing the working classes in the center, during the 1890s that idea was speedily abandoned. The progressive, that is Fabian influenced majority dominated the London County Council's Housing Committee from the start in 1890, In 1898, it recommended that the council itself build on a large scale on vacant land using Part 3 of the 1890 Act, and the full council, after much agitation and big debate, endorsed the policy, finding that they were precluded from building outside their own constricted inner London boundaries. Even then, almost entirely built up, the London County Council pressured Parliament for a 1900 amendment, allowing them to build estates of working class tenements on greenfield sites at the edge of the county and even beyond it, which they immediately used to start work on 4 such estates. And even though that same year, the moderate Conservative Party took control, keeping it until 1914, the London County Council maintained a big house building program between 1900 and 1914. They provided some 17,000 rooms in rehousing schemes on slum clearance sites within their own boundaries and another 11,000 in peripheral and out-county estates. In
Okay, stop.
1899,
Then, yeah, I think you can stop.
yeah,
So, yeah, do you want to explain this?
yeah. So, the text itself is quite clear, but one thing that one needs to focus on when one reads this chapter is 2 things, broadly speaking, which are generally important debates in planning to this day. Even today, you will hear planners debating these 2 questions quite a bit. One is the relationship between housing and transportation. And the reason for this debate um, is worth considering. For instance, if everybody knows the city of Bombay, and you all know, broadly speaking, that as you go towards Fort, the property values in the city increase, right? The closer you are to Fort, the more expensive real estate is. The further and further away you move from Fort, property prices come down. So this is generally typical of most cities. Business districts tend to have higher real estate values. As you go away towards the suburbs and beyond the suburbs, real estate values decline. And the reason is simple. There's again, this is also a kind of a complicated debate in planning why this happens. But the idea is clear enough that property values are actually a reflection of the demand for land and spatial or locational advantage in the city. The closer you are to Fort, the closer you are to other businesses, to good quality housing, so you can access much more of the economic and cultural core of the city more easily. And as you move away, you go further and further, the distance increases. So you end up spending more time to be able to access these opportunities. So where activities are generally densely concentrated, activities, institutions, people, markets, homes, businesses, etc., property values tend to be higher. So property values, broadly speaking, are a reflection of the kind of activities, economic and socio-cultural opportunities that the city offers. That is the reason why, as you move away, property prices tend to decline. Now, obviously, if you look at Bombay, you will find lots of deviations to this rule. For instance, if you look in Dharavi, property prices dip. If you go to Malabar Hill, they increase quite a lot. In Bandra, which is to the north of Dharavi, property prices are higher, right? So there are all kinds of complicated deviations to this general rule. But as a broad principle, one has to understand that this is something that you see always in most cities. The closer you are to the core, the higher the property values. Now, what happens as a result is if you are in the core, and if you buy a piece of land and you want to afford it, you will not be able to if you build a single family home, right? Because the land price is very high. So if you have to live closer to the city core, you will have to more people will have to live on a given piece of land to be able to share the cost, or divide the cost amongst many families. And that is the reason why when you go closer to the core, buildings tend to go higher, densities tend to increase, so that more families can share the higher property prices. As you move away from the core, you will have to be able to afford land much more, and so the densities tend to decline. So there's this correlation, again, a broad general correlation between property values and densities. And so what generally planners tend to think is, if you want to create affordable housing or working class housing, let's say, if you try to do that in the city center, it's going to be more difficult because then densities will go higher and all of that. So you can build in the suburbs to take advantage of the lower property prices. However, because going away from the city, you start paying in terms of time, you will have to provide cheap mass transit so that people can, so you, in a way, through technology, through mass transit, high speed mass transit, you shrink the city. You bring further places closer to the city. And through that means you can build suburban housing for poorer people, but provide the necessary connections, low cost, affordable transport so that people can find it more affordable as well as more accessible to live far away from the city, right? So there's a connection between housing and transport, which is very important to understand. And even today, for instance, just to take a more specific example, if you want to build, let's say, working class housing in Navi Mumbai, in Panvel, right? For anyone from Panvel to come to, marine lines or your back bay, they will have to spend at least 3 hours traveling. Or if you take the Panvel train, it will take you 1.5 hours at least. But if you had Trans Harbour Link, which is being built right now, if the Trans Harbour Link was a railway link, you could do that in much less time. So by reducing the time, you in fact bring that part of the city closer to the city center, right? However, if you see what is happening today, they are building a car-only road, not a public transport link. Um, so so this uh, uh, you can build more public housing in the peripheries of the city if you connect it with affordable mass transit. Now, a lot of Bombay has grown in this manner because of the railway line, and the suburban railway has been of extreme importance in making the city accessible from very far away suburbs of the city, right? So that's one debate in planning. Uh, kind of an understanding between the link about the link between housing and transport and mass transit, right? Not highways, mass transit. Another debate planning, which is a more broad debate, which is a more complicated debate, is between the relationship of property, private property, and planning. And a large part of planning for a very long time was a way of the or the in the case of London or city council, or if you look at local authorities, it is the ability of local authorities to put constraints on private property in terms of how much you can build on your land and so forth, what we call development rights, right? So that the benefits of uh, property, private property, is not, um, uh, you know, um, it does not go only to the private property owner. So one has to think about the functioning of the city as a whole as well. However, a lot of people argue that private property and planning have a much more less contrarian connection. But in fact, if you look at the history of planning, you will see that much of the development of planning has been in a way to enable private property owners, so landowners and property developers, to benefit by through planning. And this is what you will see in the later chapters when you come to the zoning discussion, that how zoning was a way of ensuring that private property owners could keep certain kinds of people out from certain areas and so forth. So these two links are important to understand: the link between housing and transport, and the link between property and planning. All right, but this is broadly what this chapter is going to be discussing. Hello, Shweta, you there? Hello,
Yeah.
Shweta?
In a sense, yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So so in a sense, to make sure that how the all these new developments of the suburbanization were clearly to ensure that the working classes in the city had access to better housing conditions. So along with changing certain policies to allow for the development, housing development in the peripheries of the city, they also had to ensure that the transport was affordable enough. So in fact, trams were seen as an instrument of social policy because they had to ensure that the cost of transport was low, so that the people who lived in the peripheries could still travel to the center for work. So in a sense, many of these suburbs which were built were entirely dependent on the city, and people still traveled back and forth from the city for livelihood. So another thing that they had to ensure is that the property prices were low, and that the transportation cost was low, so that living outside was less, it was more affordable to the working classes as opposed to living in the city center, which was what made it attractive. And obviously the advantages of more airspace and green and pleasant surroundings at no extra cost would make this shift attractive or affordable for them. But what they realized eventually is that it was often the better off skilled artisans, or somehow the either the skilled workers from the laboring class or the lower middle class who could in fact afford to go out, move out, because somehow the cost of transport and the cost of rent was somehow more expensive than living in the slum city. And very often the casual laborer or the carman or the docker who earned less than these people who moved out, they were still living in slums. And during the first full decade of the London County Council building, we realized that overcrowding in London actually worsened. It did not really solve the problem. Another issue with this kind of suburbanization was clearly that, definitely there was more space between the buildings, there was more light and ventilation. But one of the critiques of this earlier form of market driven suburbanization was also seen to be a lack of planning, because one, they kept replicating the same gridiron layouts, which were completely unimaginative. And the facades were uniform and dull gridiron layouts, and which is why these developments which took place were quite unattractive and not really aesthetic in any sense. So now we'll come to the next excerpt. Like, taking this background, we realized that why there was a push towards the first town planning schemes. This is page 54, the first town planning schemes. So the idea of town planning schemes were that because the existing bylaws were seen as crudely restrictive and it did not allow you to go beyond the gridiron, or that what they felt is that there should be urban transit, but this should be coupled with more private house building as opposed to to be seen as a solution. And this led to the first town planning scheme. Sam?
Yeah, so page 55, okay, in the PDF.
55.
Shweta is reading from the book, so the book has different page numbers. So go to page 55, Purva. Yeah. Meanwhile, compared with the London County Council, the other great urban authorities of England were doing relatively little. And many shared Booth's view that better urban transit, coupled with private house building, offered the main route to the eventual solution of the problem. The infant art of town planning should concentrate on providing a better framework within which the developer could work. That logic led to the Liberal government's Housing, Town Planning, etc. bill, which bitterly fought through Parliament. The second reading deferred no less than 19 times. Acts at the end of 1907-1908 season reintroduced, and with no less than 360 House of Lords amendments, was passed into law in 1909. Introducing it, John Burns, now as president of the local government board, retaining some echoes of the oratory that had once swayed Trafalgar Square, intoned, The object of this bill is to provide a domestic condition for the people in which their physical health, their morals, their character, and their whole social condition can be improved. The bill aims in broad outlines at and hopes to secure the home healthy, the house beautiful, the town pleasant, the city dignified, and the suburbs self, self, self,
Salubrious.
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 Salubrious. The principal means to the home healthy would be more extensive slum clearance and rebuilding powers for the local authorities. On its housing side, the bill seeks to abolish, reconstruct, and prevent the slum. It asks, at least I do for it, the House of Commons to do something to efface the ghettos of meanness and the Alsaces of squalor that can be found in the many parts of the United Kingdom. To that end, the bill reformed in the 1890 legislation, giving local authorities unambiguous powers to retain the houses they built under slum clearance schemes, thus paving the way for the post-World War I public housing drive. It also allowed the local government board to prod recalcitrant authorities into action. Indeed, it gave fairly draconian powers to the local government board. There was a widespread view, apparently shared by Burns himself, that local councils were not up to the job, and that tradition of central interference, doubtless based on that distrust, has been an abiding feature of British planning throughout the subsequent century. But the most important section of the Act dealt with the new town planning powers, which Burns explained seek to diminish what have been called bylaw streets, with little law and much monotony. It hopes to get rid of the regulation roads that are so regular that they lack the line of beauty that Hogarth was said was the curve. The bylaws, in contrast, were seen as crudely restrictive. Thus, cul-de-sacs were forbidden because they were seen as bad for public health. And at Hampstead, a special act of parliament had to be passed to circumvent the Hendon bylaws, and the Hampstead was seen as a model in the fight for greater elasticity. The model was thus a small group of schemes that had already managed to escape from the tyranny of the bylaws. They have only to take a motor car or any other vehicle and go to places like Balham, Millbank, Boundary Street, Tooting, Ealing, Hampstead, and Northfield to see how modified schemes of town planning, accompanied by schemes of transit, tram, train, and tube, are progressing. The objective, accepting London's population would continue to grow outwards, was to plan for it by gaining agreement between the public and the private sector, to get them to turn together towards one outlook with one scheme instead of mutually fighting each other, fighting to each other's detriment. Let's take Bournville for the poor and Bournemouth for the rich. Let's take Chelsea for the classes and Tooting for the masses. What do you find? You find in these four instances that your public spirited corporations and your public spirited landowners have been at work. And you will find very much done without damage to anybody of what we hope to make universal by this bill. Okay, so I want to say here we find another very important connection. So I already spoke about two important links in planning, to think about the link between housing and transport, to think about the link between planning and property. But here, actually, you have this very interesting link emerging between the role of the public authority and private actors. All right. And this is another long, persistent debate in planning as to how can the state regulate or get private sector actors to act in a way which achieves the aims of the public sector. And this is something that you see, for instance, very clearly in the way in which a lot of housing in Bombay works at the moment. A large focus of housing in Bombay at the moment is to get private actors to fulfill public responsibilities, right? So the SRA is the classic example where developers are given incentives to build housing for the poor. Now, for a very long time, the state distrusted private sector actors as saying that private sector actors will not act in concordance with public interests because they have other interests, they have private interests. In London, in the British planning tradition, you see that very clearly, that there is a distrust, and that's where the state goes and starts doing housing itself. In the American system, which has always been more pro-capitalist, the attempt always was to uh, incentivize the private sector to be able to do something which is more or less in public interest, right? So this kind of debate between uh, public action and private interests, and the kind of either the divergence between the two or the convergence between the two, is something that planners always talk about and always try to bridge. Yeah. Which section now, Shweta?
Hussein, could you also explain, give a little example of what happened? Because I think when we talk about the first town planning schemes, we also are minded of what happened in Mumbai with the Bombay Improvement Trust, or the BIT, right? Which was
Yeah,
the
yeah,
suburbanization of Mumbai during the first industrial suburbs of Bombay. So could you just
yeah.
also refer to that and kind of compare it
Right.
with this part?
Right. So, in terms of the links I spoke about, the link. So, for instance, I mean, if you again look at the geography of Bombay, you'll find that house rentals in the inner city, in places like Kamatipura, Bindi Bazaar, all the cessed areas of the city are much lower than many of the suburbs. Okay, which is again Bombay's specific deviation from the rule of closer you go to the city center, the higher the property prices. And this was done. This has been managed mainly because of legislation, which is what we call the Rent Control Act, which prevented rentals in these areas from becoming so high that the poor will not be able to live in them. Right now, it's a different matter that a lot of rich businesses and individuals also benefit from rent control. But the reason why a lot of poor people can still live in the city of Bombay, within the island city, is because of the rent control legislation. So this is one kind of interference or intervention of the state in land and housing markets to ensure that people can continue living, and the way in which the population is distributed in the city does not depend on property markets, right? So that's one important thing to remember. Now, to come to suburbanization in Bombay, a lot of these debates that we are reading about London and New York, you also see that playing out in the city of Bombay. If you look at the Bombay Improvement Trust suburban schemes, rather Parsi colony and Hindu colony and so forth, these were the first, suburbs built by through planning in the city. If we know, for instance, the kind of bylaws that they had, which prevented the buildings from going very high and so forth. But one important aspect of the suburbanization in Bombay was the street layout. And if you look at the kind of documents that the Bombay Improvement Trust put out, there are very interesting street sections. So if you look at that entire road, for instance, the Ambedkar Road, which goes to Science Circle and the King Circle and so forth, there is a reason why those roads are so wide. They were not planned earlier as 4-lane highways. Actually, they were planned as 2-lane carriageways on two sides and a tram line in the center. In fact, the tram line was built even. Today, in fact, unfortunately, a flyover is built on top of that, which goes over the circles and so forth. But the reason why these streets were so wide is because the idea was that these will be suburbs that will be connected with trams, and trams being uh, public transit, affordable public transit, right? So these ideas that we are reading about, that were first kind of mooted in London and American cities, were actually found a way to come all the way to India. In fact, later on you'll read about Lord George Lloyd, who actually was the governor of Bombay, who was a absolute authoritarian governor, who actually was also responsible for imprisoning Gandhi for 6 years on the charge of sedition. Footnote, but important. I mean, so George Lloyd was the one who even brought the Bombay Development BDD Chawls scheme was introduced by George Lloyd when he became governor in 1918. So there is all of these debates that we are reading about in this book. Actually, you will see coming back to Bombay in some way or the other, right? Okay. Yeah, Shweta. Hello, Shweta?
Sorry, the first, yeah, I would also like to point out that the first suburbanization in early colonial Bombay was in Malabar Hill, where the city's elite, the European wanted to escape from the dense, congested conditions of the old port. This was before Bombay was even industrialized. And Dadar Parsi colony and Hindu colony and the BDD Chawls and all that area is the next suburbanization after Mumbai was industrialized, and it was basically also while one sees some public housing projects, one also sees a lot of housing built for the elite classes, so the elite Hindus and the Parsis in Parsi colony and the other colony. So in a sense, it was an escape from the city, but one sees that it is not just housing for the poor that was built in the peripheries, but it was also housing for the elite, which was, with more greenery and open spaces. And, that is the Five Gardens area. If you see, that area has large open spaces. So it was not necessarily built for the poor. Now, when we come to the next section, where we are looking at New York, we will also see how this kind of suburbanization and town planning took place in America. And it was significantly different from what took place in Europe. So let's take a look at that. And in a sense, zoning was meant for this kind of decentralization of the city, and zoning was earlier the intention was public welfare. But one realizes that it becomes, in New York, it actually becomes more about maintaining real estate value. And let's read and see how that happens.
From New York discovers zoning.
Yeah, you can start on page 57 in my book. There's a by standards of bylaw planning.
Yeah, so that's page 58. That's page 58 in the PDF.
By the standards of bylaw planning, of course.
Yeah. Purva, it's page 58 in the PDF, and is the last paragraph of page 58. Yeah, that's it. By the standards of bylaw planning, of course, it is a notable advance. There is a coherence of a rather formal kind. The open space is generous and flexibly disposed. A green wedge, for instance, runs along the railway right into the edge of the shopping center. Some pieces of the old road pattern are interesting, and the small bit actually designed by the Southers, one of whom later succeeded Unwin at the Hampstead Gardens suburb, is very good. But surprisingly, there is also a long, unbroken lines of almost straight street, of unequaled bylaw tedium. Burns, one feels, orated in vain. And coupled with the uninspired neo-Georgian of the shopping parade, a style to be repeated countless times all over suburban London in the 1920s and 1930s, the effect is one of rather crushing formalism. A city beautiful that isn't very beautiful. It provides an unauspicious start for the golden age of the English suburb. New York discovers zoning. The Americans had already done much better than that. Their classic 19th century and early 20th century suburb, all planned around commuter railroad stations, Lelwyn Park in New Jersey, Lake Forest and Riverside outside Chicago, Forest Hill Gardens in New York, all had a conspicuously high standard of design. Riverside, as we shall see in chapter 4, was almost certainly one of the models for Ebenezer Howard's Garden City. These suburbs maintained sophisticated systems of social and physical control in order to maintain homogeneous communities of high quality with harmonious houses. And as American cities rapidly extended their basic municipal services outwards, the citizens of these suburbs were the main beneficiaries. They owed the flush toilets and bathtubs that flowed with ample supplies of municipal water. They were the bicyclists who benefit from the fresh asphalt pavements. They also rode the lengthy streetcar lines into suburban neighborhoods for a price equal to that paid by inner city commuters for shorter journeys. The problem was that down to 1900, there were not many of them. That was especially true in New York and Chicago, which were already too big for effective streetcar access. Here, the future would depend on subway or commuter lines. New York opened its first subway segment in 1904, and the system began to spread in the following years. As its historian has remarked, it was a response to two critical problems: rapid urban growth and awkward geography. With 3.4 million people in 1900, the world's second city, it sprawled across 7 islands separated by arduous waterways. Manhattan was 13 miles long, but only 2 miles wide at best. So the system had to be good, and it was. It was the first subway in the world with express tracks at up to 40 miles per hour. It opened huge undeveloped tracks north of 59th Street, especially on the west side, and northwards into the Bronx for middle and upper class occupation. Between 1905 and 1920, the population of Manhattan above 125th Street increased by 265%, and in the Bronx it increased by 156%. From 1910 to 1930, the population living outside Manhattan increased from 51 to 73% of the city total. But as the Tenement House Commission had reported in 1900, while undoubtedly better transit facilities will enable some of the more ambitious and better paid tenement dwellers to provide themselves with separate houses in the outlying districts, it is evident that the bulk of the laboring classes will continue to live in tenement houses. They could not afford to move. Nevertheless, one indirect effect of Weiler's scheme was that the Commission on Congestion of Population established through the efforts of settlement house leaders in 1907, which reported in 1911 in favor of decentralization through transit. But as the Commission had recognized in its own exhibition on congestion 3 years earlier, and as civic leaders appreciated, better transit was a double-edged sword. It could also spell even worse congestion in the city's core by bringing more workers and in raising land values. This was the paradox, and it could be resolved only through a complementary measure: restrictions on the height and massing of buildings. Okay, so yeah,
Yeah, you want to explain this, and then we'll move ahead.
yeah. So here it's important to point out the distinction between bylaws and zoning. Interestingly, in Bombay planning jargon, both are used, zoning and bylaws, but the way in which it is used is slightly different from the way it is spoken about in the text that we're reading. For instance, when in this text, when one talks about bylaws are basically, Purva, you mentioned that bylaws are restrictive. And that was a problem in the bylaws. Actually, the problem is not that bylaws are restrictive. Bylaws are basically minimum standards that need to be followed for mainly any kind of development, public or private, but largely for regulating private actors. The way in which this works is that if the state is not doing housing itself, how does it ensure that private actors will not be driven by the profit motive to such a degree that they will compromise on the basic essentials of environmental planning? For instance, if you want to ensure that there's enough light and ventilation in all the rooms of the house, if you don't have standards, if you don't have bylaws, developers will easily cut corners there, right? Which is bound to happen. So bylaws are a way of ensuring that certain minimum standards, acceptable standards, are maintained. Now, what happens as a result of bylaws, though, the adverse consequence is that the bylaw becomes the minimum standard and the common minimal aesthetic standard as well. And so what you get is monotony. What you get is a cookie cutter kind of housing where the limit of the bylaw is reached, and it is only that limit which prescribes how the built environment is shaped, right? And that's what you see in Bombay, for instance. In all the developer housing that you see throughout the suburbs and everywhere, the bylaws really determine the shape of the built environment, because that is a maximum that the private developers can do. Now, bylaws can be restrictive for developers, and they are always considered restrictive for developers. That's why developers always grumble about them. And architects grumble about them even more, because architects feel that bylaws restrict their freedom to design. But you must remember that it's not that the architects the bylaws restrict the architects. It is the commercial interests of developers that restrict architects. But because architects work with developers who grumble about bylaws, it's generally bylaws are always meant to seen as the villain in the whole story. Also, I mean, incidentally, bylaws are made by regulators, and nobody likes regulators. So that's what bylaws do. It creates a certain kind of maximum limit beyond which you cannot do certain things. Zoning, on the other hand, is different, where what zoning does is, in a way, it's variable as compared to bylaws, which generally tend to be general. You know, you can have common bylaws throughout the city. But what zoning does is, in certain places, it provides different sets of regulations depending on what can be permitted and what cannot be. Now, in the American situation, what happened in zoning was very closely tied with policing. How do you, and in this regard, the American system is probably the most advanced in how do you create ordinances and zoning regulations that prevent certain kinds of people from inhabiting your neighborhood. And because in the American system there was so much concern with property values, if, for instance, I mean, the way it works is that if you have, say, African Americans and Latinos living in your neighborhood, your property values will decline because nobody wants to live near them, right? So the only way to ensure that your property values do not decline is to find ways of keeping these communities out, right? And so zoning regulations were designed in a way to exclude certain groups so that commercial interests could be left intact. And that's that's the whole racist segregationist legacy of American planning. That's where zoning comes from. All right. So there are differences that are important to understand. Huh?
Yeah, I think that relationship between zoning and planning in American cities is explained on page 60. So zoning came to New York from Germany.
Yeah, so that's page 60 in the PDF. So zoning came to New York from Germany. Perhaps that's an oversimplification. Mundanely, American land use zoning seems to have originated in an attempt to control the spread of Chinese laundries in California, first in the city of Modesto and then in San Francisco in the 1880s. And from 1909 onwards, Los Angeles developed comprehensive land use zoning. But it was the German model of combined land use and height zoning that was imported to New York City in 1916. Zoning ordinance, which so contemporaries believed, was the most significant development in the early history of American city planning. And the Manhattan case was basically different from almost anywhere else in America. Here, zoning was not residential. It was not concerned with regulating land use. It was commercial, and it was concerned with the bulk and massing of buildings. It was supported by powerful commercial interests who saw it as a way of protecting the value of existing real estate against undesirable invasions, principally garment shops and garment workers who would invade the prestige stores of Midtown. Indeed, according to investigators from Fifth Avenue Association, it was directed against Hebrews swarming from nearby lofts at lunchtime. It reflected the conditions of 1916, a real estate depression in which it mattered more to protect existing values than to create new ones. What the 1916 ordinance failed to do, despite the hopes of one influential and enthusiastic group, was to serve as a prelude to a fuller comprehensive plan. So I'm skipping that next paragraph and going to the one following that. As more than one observer pointed out, both then and subsequently, New York embraced zoning so enthusiastically because it was good for business. The Fifth Avenue merchants were concerned that floods of immigrant garment workers on the noontime streets would destroy the exclusive character of their businesses and would thus threaten their property values. They appealed to every financial interest and to every man who owns a home or rents an apartment. The Commission on Heights of Buildings confirmed that zoning secured greater safety and security in investment. The very year of the New York Ordinance, John Nollin would agree with an English writer that American city planning essentially aimed at civic improvements that did not interfere with vested interests. And as the zoning movement rapidly spread from New York across the nation, this was its image. It was indeed an odd kind of planning, but the relationship between zoning and planning was an indirect and torturous one. Again, I'm skipping the rest of the paragraph and going to the subsequent paragraph, page 62. In any case, the real point was why American cities so enthusiastically embraced the concept of zoning. The sordid reason was self-interest. In practice, as in New York, zoning became primarily a static process of attempting to set and preserve the character of certain neighborhoods in order to preserve property values in these areas while imposing only nominal restrictions on those areas holding a promise of speculative profit. In Euclid versus Ambler, the great planner lawyer Alfred Bettman, whose brief submitted late in the hearing may have well proved crucial, argued that the public welfare served by zoning was the enhancement of the community's property values. The point significantly was whether land should be zoned as industrial or residential. The court gave the respectable residents of Euclid, a middle-class dormitory village next door to Cleveland, a guarantee that their investments would not be threatened. Bassett, the father of the New York scheme, later wrote that one of zoning's major purposes was to prevent the premature depreciation of settled localities. Or later, commentator put it, the basic purpose of zoning was to keep them where they belonged, out. If they had gotten in, then its purpose was to confine them to limited areas. The exact identity of them varied a bit around the country. Blacks, Latinos, and poor people qualified. Catholics, Jews, and Orientals were targets in many places. The elderly also qualified if they were candidates for public housing. Zoning, in fact, simply reproduced arrangements that had informally prevailed in exclusive residential suburbs long before it arrived, and that combined four interrelated elements: careful site selection, comprehensive planning, creation of a defensive framework of property restrictions, local ordinances, and boundary making strategies that an underlying communal consensus. The walled and gated enclave suburban communities that have proliferated since 1980 are merely a later day manifestation of a long American tradition, impelled perhaps by an aging cohort's fear of crime. The standard text of the late 1920s indeed could openly promote zoning on the basis that it stabilized property values. In every city with well-established zoning, the authors reported, property values are reported stabilized and in many instances substantially increased, a fact that had been quickly recognized by financial institutions everywhere. Zoning and plat control, they emphasized, divide honors in being reported the most profitable results of city planning. As they proudly proclaimed in chapter heading, it pays to plan. Far from realizing greater social justice for the poor locked in the tenements of New York and Chicago, the planning and zoning system of the 1920s was designed precisely to keep them out of the desirable new suburbs that were being built along the streetcar tracks and the subway lines. So as he points out that all the gated developments that you see, even in cities like Bombay, just think about your Pawai, Hiranandani, Raheja, all of these enclaves that are built in different parts of the city are in a way a reflection of this zoning idea that emerged in the 1920s. It has changed quite a lot today. You don't call it zoning, but it's the same idea. How do you keep certain communities and certain groups of people out through various means, whether you have restrictive property prices so that it's unaffordable for people, whether you create certain kinds of governance structures that exclude certain groups, or whether you use landscaping and other features to to distance certain kinds of developments from other more undesirable parts of the city and so forth. All of these are inherited from the zoning and planning system, which was first introduced in American cities in the 1920s.
Okay. Hussein? Yeah. Yeah. Can we move to page 68 now, where we look at London again and how the housing situation in London was about to change. And overnight, the housing of the working classes became a public responsibility as opposed to being built by private developers. So this is page 68. All this was to change.
All this was to change. Yeah, that's page 70 in the PDF. Purva, page 70. You got that? Okay. This is the second paragraph. All this was to change. Almost overnight, the housing of the working classes, the term was still openly used, then and for long after, came to be a public responsibility. The result between two world wars was more than 1 million local authority dwellings, most of them single-family cottage houses, with their own gardens in the form of satellites at the peripheries of the cities. Sometimes, as with the developments by Manchester at Wethenshaw, Liverpool at Speck, or London at Becontree, these amounted almost to new homes, albeit lacking sufficient industry to make them anything like self-contained. But they were the largest planned developments in England at the time, dwarfing the then garden cities. Becontree reached the 100
move to the next page. Skip this part. Come to the report represented Unwin's personal triumph.
Yeah, that's page 71. Last two sentences.
Yeah.
Yeah, towards the end of this page. Yeah, the report represented Unwin's personal triumph. All his basic ideas, carried through from his 1912 pamphlet, Nothing Gained by Overcrowding, were here. The minimum distance of 70 feet between houses to guarantee winter sunshine, the use of short terraces, the garden for every family, the use of spare backland as recreational space, the emphasis on cul-de-sac for safe children's play. Partly these recommendations stemmed from the remarkable experiment of employing a separate women's housing subcommittee, of whose recommendation Unwin seems to have taken just so much as he wished, rejecting, for instance, the recommendation that every house must have a separate parlor. The report was radical enough. What was remarkable was its immediate endorsement. But the fact was that the government was running scared. The day after the armistice, Lloyd George, remember, governor of Bombay as well in 1918, announced what came to be known as the khaki election, promising in one of those celebrated statements that were always misquoted, habitations fit for the heroes who have won the war. The next February, back in office at a conference with ministers, the Prime Minister recounted an anecdote. A well-to-do man went to remonstrate with the miners. One of them, a fairly educated man and a Scotsman, said, "Do you know the place I live in? He lives in one of those houses that are back to back, with all the sewage brought right through the living room, and he has all his children living in that place." He said, "Supposing your children lived in those conditions, what would happen to you?" The well-to-do man said frankly, "I should be a Bolshevik." Bolshevik is a communist. Huh? Neville Chamberlain responded, "I agree to our housing problem. Uh, uh, I agree that our housing problem has gotten to such a condition that it is a threat to the stability of the state." The next month, in cabinet, Lloyd George returned to what was evidently an obsession. Quote, "In a short time, we might have 3/4 of Europe converted to Bolshevism. Great Britain would hold out, but only if people were given a sense of confidence. We had promised them reform time and time again, but little has been done. Even if it cost £100 million, what was that compared with the stability of the state? after a month after, the parliamentary secretary to the local government board repeated that the money we are going to spend on housing is an insurance against Bolshevism and revolution. And this was to be embodied not merely in the fact that house was built, but also in its design. New houses built by the state, each with its own garden, surrounded by trees and hedges and equipped internally with the amenities of a middle-class home, was to provide visible proof of the irrelevance of revolution. The insurance policy was duly
Okay,
taken
now
out in
you
the...
can stop there. Yeah, you can stop there. So now let's just come to the next part, page
Yeah, but this part
76.
is clear enough, right? This part is clear enough.
Yeah.
Basically, in London, in the UK, there was a fear of working class uprising, the threat of communism, and the overthrow of the state, which meant that the government took very seriously the effort to house working people, because what they felt was, if we don't give people middle class standards of housing, they will be so mad that they will simply overthrow us. And
Yeah.
therefore, it
It
was
also
thought necessary to spend public money to be able to give people better standards of living. Yeah, Shweta, you're saying?
it also shows how the approach in America was significantly different from that in England, London, right? So,
Yeah.
where again suburbanization was largely driven by zoning and real estate values and the preservation of the property values, whereas here it's also about public welfare and making sure that people don't have a reason to revolt. So the working
Yeah.
class clearly being taken care of here, as opposed uh, to uh, America, where you see a lot of racial and class-based segregation, which is also driving urban development.
Yeah.
So now we'll
Okay.
come to the last section, the building of suburbia. That is page 76.
Yeah. Okay. From that section, that's page
Yeah. Are you tired? You
70.
want me?
No, I'm fine. It's page
All right.
78.
Yeah.
Page 78 in the PDF. Yeah. Okay. Uh, the building of suburbia. This reaction came, of course, from someone on the other side of the great housing divide, which by then had sprung up across England, though nowhere more starkly than in the home counties around London. On that other side, a new industry had effectively been created, catering for a new market. Before World War I, the overwhelming majority of the entire population had rented their homes. After it, a number of factors conspired to persuade millions of the new middle class to buy. Huge changes in the structure of the economy were creating a new white-collar class, whose numbers rose from 20 to 30% of the workforce between 1911 and 1951. White-collar class is basically middle-class professional people. Architects are white-collar workers. Real incomes for a large section of the population, especially this new white-collar group, and the skilled blue-collar workers, meaning blue-collar meaning working-class people, whose jobs were disproportionately in and around London, were rising sharply. The building societies attracted huge funds, especially in the depression of the 1930s, when industrial shares became unattractive. By various devices, insurance guarantees, the development of a builder's pool, whereby a developer took the risk, the proportion loan could be raised as high as 95%. At Bexley in the 1930s, keys to the cheapest houses could be had for a deposit, for a £5 deposit, and if this were lacking, the estate agent or builder would lend it. Interest payments reached a low point of 4.5% in the mid-1930s. In Britain, new lending by building societies totaled £7 million in 1918, £32 million in 1923, and £75 million in 1929, and 103 in 1933. Alan Jackson stated that 75% of all new homes in interwar suburban London were bought out on a mortgage. On the supply side, larger established builders like Costain, Couch, Lang, Taylor, Woodrow, Waits, and Wimpey competed with a host of small firms existing on precarious profit margins and cash flows, which often went under but kept prices keen. And in the depths of an agricultural depression, land was cheap. A plot could be had for as little as 20 pounds. So families with modest incomes, skilled manual workers earning as little as 3.5 pounds a week could now afford to buy. In the 1930s, £1 a week could buy the standard three-bedroom semi-detached while those earning 300 to 500 pounds a year, teachers, bank officials, executive class civil servants could afford bigger houses, perhaps detached.
Okay,
But these different
Hussein,
agents,
come to the next page. Come to the next page. A
huh,
carefully designed development and start from there.
a carefully designed development um, would be marked by a variety of house styles, winding roads, closes and crescents, generous gardens, tree plantings, and grassed verges. But often the speculative suburb lacked any overall plan, being developed road by road by numerous builders until land ran out. The result of such activity was sometimes a long sprawl of monotony, similar semi-detached houses along a busy arterial road, backed by a waste of derelict agricultural land remote from amenities such as shops, schools, and stations. Since the frontage was the dearest aspect and also the basis of cost, long, narrow plots between 20, 25 and 35 wide were the rule, producing parallel rows on identical plots. At the bottom end of the market, speed of building was of the essence. A rural landscape could be transformed into a new estate within a month. So trees were uprooted and natural features ignored. Roads were laid out in aimless serpentine fashion or simply followed old field paths, leaving an impression that managed to be simultaneously restless and monotonous. The result was a segregated landscape of suburbia, in which the kind and density of the housing immediately suggested the social status of those within it. And the 1932 Act actually encouraged this by giving councils the opportunity to lay down variations in density all the way down to one house per 5, 10, or 25 acres, invariably without liability to pay compensation. Usually, the starting point was either a concentration of shops and flats in mock Tudor or debased classical around railway or tube station. A giant cinema might be another prominent feature. Thence, building proceeded in ribbons, followed feeder bus services along the new arterial bypass roads designed ironically to reduce traffic congestion, and financed under unemployment relief programs in two bursts in the early 1920s and the mid 1930s without benefit until an act of 1935 of any limitation on foot frontage development. The resulting pattern was immortalized by the cartoonist Osborne Lancaster as bypass variegated. Here are some quaint gables culled from Art Nouveau, surmounting a facade that is plainly modernistic in inspiration. There are twisted beams and leaded panes of stockbroker's Tudor are happily contrasted with bright green tiles of obviously prudish origin. Next door, some terracotta plaques, Pont Street Dutch in character, and live in a white wood Wimbledon transitional porch, making it a splendid foil to a red brick garage that is vaguely Romanesque in feeling. I continue.
Yeah, continue.
Rustic names like Meadowside, Woods View, and Fields End all too soon became misnomers. The Southern Railway, with three successive stations called Park, Rains, Motspur, and Worcester, narrowly avoided the appellation being awarded to yet a fourth, Stoneleigh. The result was universally derided and condemned. The fact was that the prosecutors were all upper middle class and the offenders were mostly lower middle class. In a typical such suburb, Bexley, which gained 18,000 houses and 52,000 people in the 1930s, the 1951 census showed that the overwhelming majority came from social class 3, the skilled manual and junior non-manual grades. Moving as they did from by-law terraces without bathrooms or inside lavatories, they were enjoying a quantum leap in their quality of life, and wherever they place in the hierarchy of snobbery, the suburbs showed the same characteristic of one family houses in gardens and an environment more or less removed from the dirt, noise, and congestion of the city. But suburbia did more for them. Uniform and monotonous as they might seem from the outside, their new occupants, each house embodied tiny variations built in or bought in, which gave it individuality. A stained glass window, a porch, a kitchen fitting, even a garden gnome. The house itself was designed to express individuality, hence The bay window and the corner door, the great variation in every minor detail, the lack of collective space around the house, all consciously designed to be unlike council housing as possible. But the architects did not like it. Repeatedly in their journals, at their congresses during the 1930s, they railed about the suburbs. The suburbs' chief fault seems to be that they have been conspicuously diverged from either of then main standards of good taste, the Neo-Georgian, as still taught in leading schools like Liverpool, or the uncompromisingly modern embraced by young members of the Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne. Instead, their cozy imitation vernacular derived from a much older architectural tradition pioneered by John Nash at Blaze, Hamlet, and Park Village West, and subsequently developed to a high art by such late Victorians as Philip Webb, Norman Shaw, and Raymond Unwin. Perhaps significantly, the first two had opposed the whole idea of a closed architectural profession, and Parker was trained as an interior decorator. But of course, the result was a pastiche, and often an unsuccessful one. Osbert Lancaster put it all the better, that is to say, more savagely than any of the professionals. If an architect of enormous energy, painstaking ingenuity, and great structural knowledge had devoted years of his life to the study of how best to achieve the maximum of inconvenience in the shape and arrangement under one roof of a stated number of rooms, and had the assistance of corps of research workers ransacking architectural history for the least attractive materials and building devices known in the past, it is just possible, though highly unlikely, that he might have evolved a style as crazy as that which, with the speculative builder, with no expenditure of mental energy at all, has enriched the landscape on either side of our great arterial roads. Notice the skill with which the houses are disposed that ensures that the largest possible area of the countryside is ruined with the minimum of expense. See how carefully each householder is provided the clear view into the most private offices of his next door neighbor, and with what studied disregard of the sun's aspect the principal rooms are planned. So, what Peter Hall is now trying to talk about is the way in which the mass transit suburb transformed into a car transit suburb, a suburb which was, at least in London, even today, if you go to London and if you go to the suburban parts of London, you will, the metro will take you to a particular place. From there, you can walk into these endless rows and rows and rows of, standardized single plot development housing, which, as he's describing, are extremely monotonous, but because they are all, they are laid out not in a gridiron but in a sort of a curvilinear manner, it's also what he describes as restless. They are not they're restless and monotonous at the same time.
But they also each designed in their unique style. So I think what is interesting is also that variation or those different styles and individuality that each of those houses represent, which make them more attractive to the people.
To the people who live in them, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and people who want to move out of the urban housing, or those the council housing that is very monotonous. So in a sense, this gives people an opportunity to have their own garden, their own individual house, again, designed according to their unique preferences. And somehow what he also points out, and especially in the next section, which is called the architect's revenge, is that how the people who lived in these houses, and people who had definitely moved to much better living conditions than they were in the city, were hated by architects. And also, it was there's also issue of how it was the lower middle classes who migrated out and were living in these developments, and how the countryside then became invaded by these new housing suburbs, which were somehow not really liked by people of the upper classes, who and also people who the elite,
yeah.
Architects. Yeah. So I think that's what he covers in the next section. So I think you can continue reading it.
Yeah. The architect's revenge. Whether it was sour grapes or not, the architects were angry. They wanted revenge. They were not the only ones, though they led the attack. Their metaphors were sometimes military, sometimes clinical. Chloe Williams Ellis in England and the Octopus wrote of urban development as the disfiguring little buildings that grow up and multiply like nettles along a drain, like lice along upon a tapeworm. Bungalows constitute England's most disfiguring disease, having from the sporadic beginnings now become a premier disease. By 1933, he was declaring that I would certainly sooner go back for another year in wartime press than spend a 12-month in post-war Slough. Should that sound like an overstatement, I should explain that it is merely the prudent desire of those who desires to remain happily alive and who would therefore assuredly choose an 80% risk of being shot, gassed, or blown up in heroic company to the certainty of cutting his own throat in surroundings of humiliating squalor. Slough, as also for Betjeman, became the symbol of all that was wrong. Yet Betjeman loved some suburbia, as witness his television labor of love on Metro land. A verge in front of your house and grass and a tree for the dog. Variety created in each facade of the houses, in the coloring of the trees. In fact, the country had come to the suburbs. Roses are blooming in Metro land just as they do in the brochures. These, like Surrey, were the good suburbs inhabited by lovable Betchmanesque characters like Pam, the great big mountainous sports girl, or Miss Hunter Dunn, sitting the evening long in the car park in the full Surrey twilight. But Slough, like Ruslip Gardens, from which metro station, with thousand towers and pardons, daintily alights Aline. These were quite other places, occupied exclusively by low middle class despoilers of the countryside. Abercrombie, who had taken the lead in founding the Council for the Preservation of Rural England, took a more sanguine view of the bungalow disease. Seriously, it is not the damage is not the damage largely skin deep? Will many of what you rightly call blasphemous bungalows blaspheme for long? And is not much of England Virgin County intact here? He was more concerned about ribbon growth. These strips of the countryside are being colonized with no more rationale of social grouping or economies of estate development or aesthetics of rural design than existed during the Industrial Revolution of last century. But he too was convinced that this rural England of ours is at this moment menaced with a more sudden and more thorough change than ever before, too rapid to permit automatic adjustment. He wrote wistfully of the Chinese practitioner of Feng Shui, whose job it is to study and expound the shapes which the spiritual forces of nature have produced, and to prescribe the ways in which all buildings, roads, bridges, canals, and railways must conform to them, is placed in the position of extreme power, and we ourselves can hardly hope to be able to similarly to explode some flaring upstart bungalow or satanic mill to conflagrate the perpetuation of certain huh? the
No,
perpetuation
no.
of certain countryside blasting advertisements in their own spirit. But he thought, he thought they certainly showed the right way. In 1938, Williams Ellis was back on the attack with Britain and the Beast, an edited volume of essays by such leading figures of the day as John Maynard Keynes, E.M. Forrester, C.E.M. Joad, G.M. Hmm? You saying
No,
something?
Foster. No. It's fine. I was just correcting you.
Okay. In it, Joad presented the people's claim to the countryside. 2000's nature, newly discovered, has been will-o'-the-wisp as to lured into the countryside, find that it has disappeared. In 50 years' time, there will in southern England be neither town nor country, but only a single dispersed suburb sprawling unendingly from Watford to the coast. To guard against this, the extension of the towns must be stopped. Building must be restricted to sharply defined areas, and such rehousing of the population as may be necessary must be carried on within these areas. So, so one of the things that this also moves towards is the arrival of the kind of regional planning that we are going to see in the next chapter, where planners try to control the way in which suburbs endlessly grew into the country. And that's how the ideas of uh, green belts and things like that were introduced. But so that's something that's going to come. So I'm not going to go deeper into that. But it comes from this concern of this city spreading endlessly and monotonously into the country. Shada, you want me to continue reading, or should we
Yeah,
jump
I
to the
think
next?
come to the last part, maybe page 85. Um,
Ah,
the then permanent secretary of the Ministry of Health.
then page 85.
Yeah. Uh, in that paragraph, by that time, indeed, interim development orders.
Yeah. That's page 87 in the PDF.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, by that time, indeed, interim development orders covered some 19.5 million acres, or 50% of the entire country. The half, moreover, where large-scale development was occurring. In Surrey, one of the counties most affected by London's growth, almost all landowners were voluntarily accepting restrictions on development, thus avoiding death and estate duties. The then permanent secretary of the Ministry of Health commented that nobody who goes about the country today can fail to observe that the tide of sporadic, unregulated development that threatened to engulf the South after the war is being stemmed, and that planning is beginning to leave a visible mark on the English countryside. The 1932 Act was an advance. It allowed local authorities to make schemes for almost any land, including rural areas. By 1942, 73% of all land in England was subject to interim development control, which, in conjunction with the draft scheme, had become the favored mechanism of control. But not everyone would agree that it was effective, certainly not Professor George. By 1938, Williams, Ellises, and the Georges had a new and profound supporter. On every one of his public appearances in 1920s and 30s, Frank Pick bemoaned the opportunity that was being lost by the failure to plan. In 1927, there was much planning, but no plan. The needs of the moment were met sometimes exceedingly well, but without reference to the whole. Unfortunately for London, it was never so far. It has so far never had a direct head. It is it is that low stage of animal development in which the brain is rudimentary and ganglia scattered throughout the organism stimulates such activity as serves to keep the creature alive. In 1936, such developments are most analogous to cancerous growth. In 1938, the risk was of an amorphous mass of building in which London's country would suffer from confluent pox. His voice joined to the chorus proved irresistible. Neville Chamberlain, on becoming Prime Minister at the end of 1937, almost immediately set up a royal commission on the geographical distribution of industrial population, chaired by Sir Anderson Montague Barlow. The following year, in his evidence to the Barlow Commission, Pick had arrived at the argument that if London grew beyond the magic 12-15-mile limit set by economics of the tube, it must cease to be intrinsically London, a unitary conception. So he argued, London's growth should be contained. It would be possible to go on layering first industry, then residences, then industry, and then residences, and building indefinitely, but then that would not be London. It would be putting rings of industrial towns around London, and that would not be London. For this reason, he favored both a green belt, at least a mile wide around London, and controls on new industry at the edge of London. Perhaps Pick's enthusiasm for planning was not entirely disinterested. He wanted controls on London's physical growth, but not on further expansion of jobs, which suited London's transports book. His prophetic fear that the growth of car ownership will lead to low density sprawl was also the view of public transport advocate. But in all he wrote, there emerges a consistent, almost cartoon-like vision of a giant, organically planned conurbation in which a single integrated public transport system would provide the nerve structure for the body, and land use planning would guide the healthy growth of the organism. Pick was no doubt in the 1930s that the latter was lacking. What goes by the name is idle and useless so far. To that extent, Pick was joining his weighty voice to the chorus demanding controls on London's further growth. But there was a subtle difference between them. Frederick Osborne asked whether he would agree with Pick that a city was not growing, was a city in decay, replied, I would even go to the other extreme and say that the ideal town from the rating point of view is the static town. When the Commission reported in 1940, it recorded Pick's view that London could grow further to a population of 10 to 12 million, but found against it, argued on the contrary for the planned dispersal of population to self-contained new towns and an overall reduction in London's population. So the Barlow commissioners accepted a limit on London's growth, Osborne style rather than Pitt style, thus setting in train a course of events that culminated in the 1947 Town Country Planning Act. Britain at last would have a land use planning system that could effectively shape the growth of London and indeed of every city, town, and village in the land. And I must add that the first town country planning regulation in Bombay was a 1957 Town Planning Act, and it was in 1966 that the City and Regional Planning Act was passed, and a lot of it was inspired by the London Town Country Planning Act, and that is the reason why, in the at least post-independence, in the early planning, there was a lot of thought in, and planners often constantly worried about the unending sprawling growth of Bombay City, and that there should be a way of controlling this growth. And that is the reason why the new Bombay idea was introduced. And so when we get into regional planning, we'll talk about all that story. But we must bear in mind that it emerges from all of these early debates in London.
Yeah. So I think one must add that there were many critiques of the suburbia,
Yeah, sure.
Suburban sprawl. One
Hello.
is it could be.
Hello,
am I mute? Can you hear me?
Hello. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Now we can hear.
Okay. So there were many critiques of suburban sprawl. So as we know, one of the critiques has also been aesthetic of, these horrible, monstrous developments that are invading the countryside of London. There are environmental arguments because one realizes that because of the lack of planning, there were the natural, beauty of the countryside and also natural forests, trees, streams, etc. were just not considered, and the sprawl just continued destroying all the natural areas and woodlands that existed. So there was an environmental argument. There is also an argument about the cars, as you know, because earlier they were mass transit suburbs, which were triggered by public transport systems along mass transit corridors. But at least most of the American suburbs were kind of driven by the transport infrastructure for the private vehicle, and you also had an environmental argument that you had more and more people traveling back and forth from cities, creating more pollution. So I think there are multifold arguments against these kinds of suburban developments. And through this critique, one realizes that the next two chapters, in fact, we will look at Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, which, although people kind of mistake that, the idea of the suburbs has come from the Garden City idea, but one realizes that his imagination of decentralization and deconcentration was very different from this kind of suburban sprawl that was taking place in both London and American cities. And one also comes to the chapter 5, and the roots of chapter 5 are also laid here, where one realizes the importance of the need for planning the countryside. Most of this land development that was taking place outside the city was speculative. It was driven by real estate interests, and it really did not have any kind of, understanding of land use or, the values of the countryside that were being lost. So the whole idea of regional planning and the development of green belt and the containment of the cities into dense concentrations, which was surrounded by natural wilderness areas or the countryside, that comes in chapter 5. So I think the roots of the next two chapters are also somehow in this chapter where he's describing what led to the development of the suburbs and what were the different manifestations of suburbanization.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes for discussion. Anybody has any questions, comments? Is everybody awake? Did they follow?
Yeah, so you all can also comment in terms of whether it's too fast or are you able to follow, like, because we clearly cannot see you guys, and so it's becoming more like a one-way communication. So y'all can also in your comments, y'all can also tell us your feedback in terms of whether y'all are understanding or following, or is it going too fast, or is there more explanation required.
Anyone? Hello? Is everybody asleep?
I don't know where they are. Are they there?
I would be surprised if everybody's gone off and doing other things.
No, we are like
Yeah,
here.
yeah. Okay.
Hello.
Ha.
Hello. Hussain, I had a question.
Yeah.
Considering the concept of zoning, in New
Uh,
York, we have like these suburbs of sorts where you have Harlem and you have Manhattan, you have Brooklyn. So were these the products of zoning, or did they just develop on their own and then they were separated out from the city of New York as um
uh, so, I mean, I'm not really an expert on the history of planning in New York, but from what I understand, roughly, see, I mean, if you look at the New York City, from if you look, just pull out a plan of New York, you will find that the entire city is has a Gridian system. And this was basically the logic of planning in New York City was primarily based on real estate and property development, and the entire street grid was deployed for the laying out of services and infrastructure and so forth, right? What generally tends to happen in places like Harlem, as he was mentioning, Peter Hall mentions in the text that in many places where people already lived, where poor people already lived, the zoning ordinances were meant to keep them there so that they don't move to other places. So zoning affected people in two different ways. One is that you keep certain groups of people out of certain areas, but once people are in a certain area, you also ensure that they remain there. So that is how it affected. So if you want to study specific neighborhoods in New York, say Harlem or Queens or Brooklyn or whatever, you should really refer to a more a better authoritative history of New York City. I could recommend a book by I forget his name. It's called The History of Housing in New York. It's a very good book. I'll give you the name of the author, which is an excellent book. Goes through the history of housing and planning in in New York, which you can read. You'll get more information about this specific question.
okay.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
I think in London it's a little different though. That in fact it was the lower middle classes who then finally built lived in houses in the suburbs, and until then the countryside was always a place where the elite kind of had this monopoly, right? Because they had their vast country estates, and now it was suddenly the poor people who was living in housing in the suburbs. So there's also this kind of class conflict that one sees, where the most of the people who are criticizing the suburbs are also upset that this kind of untasteful development that
Yeah.
is taking place, destroying the countryside. So the
One
conservationists and the preservationists are also a part of that group, especially people who want to preserve the aesthetic value of the countryside, and are then
Yeah.
against this kind of development.
So
Okay.
one interesting contrast that you will see amongst American cities and European cities is that so first of all, Harlem is not a suburb. Harlem is, I mean, a lot of in American cities, downtown is generally considered to be a place where the poor live. So whereas
Yeah.
whereas the wealthy tend to suburbanize, so there was a whole movement, especially post Second World War, where a lot of people moved out from the city. It's called white flight. White people generally moving out of the city, in again in a kind of a furthering this kind of segregation in American cities. In Europe, it generally tends to be the converse. The rich tend to live in the core areas of the city, and the poor people tend to live further away in the suburbs. So this contrast, this structure is very different for American and European cities. In cities for in Indian cities, you don't see both these patterns. In fact, it's a very mixed picture where you find the poor living both in the core as well as in the periphery. So you find these contrasts in different parts of the world, and this has a lot to do with the nature of the economy and the way in which certain kinds of legislations have been passed, and the whole nature of the state and the real estate development and so forth. So these variations generally play a role in determining the way in which these city patterns emerge.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
But in a sense, some of the town planning schemes, like if you look at some of the towns planning schemes in Bandra and Juhu, they were also clearly, where you had bungalow schemes and you had, these kind of deconcentrated schemes or housing schemes were clearly like you can actually see that kind of segregation even in Bombay, because there were clearly certain housing schemes built for the elite, based on this garden city model of the suburbs, which often imitate developments elsewhere.
Mm.
Okay.
So one more question and then we will wind up. Anyone? All right. So then let's do this. Next week, everybody reads the next chapter, which is The City in the Garden. And please bear in mind that if we don't have a majority of the class, a majority means a super majority. So 75 to 80%, if you haven't read the chapter, we will not do the class. Okay, so please read it. Take your time and read it. As you see, we will read parts of it again in class. But the idea is that if you read it once, the second time you read it, you will follow much better. If in class is the first time you are reading it, it will be much more difficult for you to follow what is being discussed. All right.
Yeah. Also, if you all have any comments or questions on this chapter, so it could be even things that it makes you think about, or certain questions related to your own city, you all can just post it on in the comment section. So I think
In the chat.
after every class, we can look at it over the week and maybe use it in the
Address it in the
discussion.
next. Okay, so then see you next week, guys.
Yeah. Also, some
Hello?
feedback, because I see. Hello.
Yeah, if there's some feedback, also you can post it on the chat.
Whether it's easy to follow the class, or whether you're understanding, or it's clear enough, and so that will also be helpful for us to be able to do this better.
Yeah. Okay, and please realize that this is the first time we are doing it online as well. So we are also learning on how to live with this new reality. So if you have any feedback, please let us know. Honest feedback will be most appreciated. Okay. So then see you guys. Bye guys. See you next week. Take
Thank you,
care.
Asin. Thank you, Shweta.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.